Point.
We're living in a, the modern age of the new psychedelic renaissance.
And I thought, this is not real. This is, my gosh, I'm on the radio. People hear me.
How we give to others and affect others' lives, and what we do with it is important.
Don't focus on the rest of the world, just focus on your own life.
And facts can't deal with emotions. It's like apples and oranges.
Bronze Age and Iron Age, I think it all could all be called the Wood Age.
You're not picking a president, you're actually picking a roommate.
Because you don't know what their story is. You don't know what pain they're dealing with.
Always part of me wanted an audience.
It's naive to think that human beings have stopped evolving.
The people are purple.
The world is a very rich place if you start exploring.
Okay, hello everybody. Today we'll be talking about tool use as an indicator of language, or the syntax of tools. And this image right here that you see, that's some personal arrowheads that I happen to have back at home in the States. So yeah, there you can just see some beautiful examples of some arrowheads here. These are all modern right here. They're not ancient. Take a look at those. So, how is tool use spread? Well, cultural transmission, in 2 words. You learn from other people, you learn from your conspecifics, from imitation, from people verbally telling you. There's a number of ways that it can be culturally transmitted. And cultural transmission means that the behavior does not have to be learned from scratch. With every generation, you can build on the works of others. So, you don't have to relearn the wheel, to use an old adage. And so this goes into a little bit with the role of niche construction, in that people change their environments, and then in turn those environments then select for some of those same traits. And tools are also present in other species, such as chimps, orangutans, dolphins, which I'll mention a little bit. And interesting thing, orangutans versus chimps. Chimps use more they use tools more for sustenance that can actually add to their survival, whereas orangutans use tools more for comfort, such as nest building. And right here, here's some tools used for flint knapping. So you have a bopper right here, you have an ishi stick, and there's ishi right here. Ishi helped spread this ancient Native American tool for making arrowheads. So an ishi stick is something more for taking off smaller chips. Kind of goes into the idea of bifacial thinning, which is a little more complex way to remove stone from or if you don't want to use a ishi stick, you could also use a deer antler. You could get more power with the ishi stick just because you can use more of the power of your arm and dig in there instead of just your hand. So that's what I found, at least. And here's some examples: edging, thinning, and shaping. Here's a blank being turned into a hand axe. So here are some different primates with their tool using, and you can see right here the preconditions. The intelligence, higher for the gorillas, are quite intelligent. Here's extractive foraging, which is using tools more for getting extracting food, maybe taking out some sort of using a straw or something to extract some sort of liquid to drink, or nest building. That's really just orangutans. The PP Morio, Wormby, a belly, and then the foraging. The pan troglodytes homo that would be the chimpanzees. Down here, Cepus macaca is more. That's macaques. Use more foraging, so less. It's a little simpler stuff. Then up here are the gorillas. And here's bottlenose dolphin sponging in Shark Bay, Australia. And you can just see in the map here are locations of spongers and non-spongers, and whether they have the mitochondrial DNA haplotype. I'm not going to go into all that. That's just an interesting little note here. But it is culturally transmitted. It's passed along the matriline, from mother to offspring. All offspring do it, and then eventually, as they get older, the females continue doing it, and the males stop. Okay, so the cognitive bases of human tool use. So if you go back to non-human primates, they can be very pragmatic with tool use, and they often fail causal reasoning tests. So basically, if you give them a tool to accomplish a certain task, and they're not going to really generalize that tool as being used for a certain thing. That, as soon as a new tool comes along, they'll go and try that. They're not going to immediately generalize that tool. There's also executive control, which comes in multiple parts. There's inhibition, which is basically being able to suppress your current drives, whatever you're immediately being urged to do. You can control yourself. Auto cueing. So without some present external stimuli, you're able to partake in behavior. There's foresight, which is very important in tool use. To form long-term goals. And there's monitor ongoing action. To be able to be present, be very aware of exactly what you're doing. So that fourth one has been observed in chimpanzees in the wild, and possibly the second, auto cueing. The first one has been observed in chimpanzees and orangutans with training. And the third one, there's no conclusive evidence. There's no evidence as of now. One of the conclusions of this paper is that language is helpful, but it is not necessary with teaching and tool use. So mother chimps will often leave stones and nuts near an anvil, like an anvil just meaning some object that they will hit the rock on to crack the nut open. So they'll leave the tools near this anvil, and they might even lend those tools to their offspring, but they're not using actual language in a narrow sense. They're just kind of leading their young to the tools. It's still a form of cultural learning, just a little simpler. So there's a couple of possibilities here. So there's the early advances in tool use may have been causal in language evolution through increased hand dexterity. So you can imagine that as your hands become more dexterous with different tools, you become more adept at using certain gestures. And this goes into the gesture first hypothesis, which I will discuss later. and you're better at gestures, and then eventually that is extrapolated into spoken language. Some of those same underlying cognitive structures. Another possibility is that advanced tool use provides the ability to combine and integrate lower order elements where resources originally for structuring manual hierarchies were exapted for language. It could be a combination of the two, I suppose. But basically it goes to the idea of the syntax of tools, of praxis, I should say. So because we were using tools, we had this ability to combine these physical elements together into into certain hierarchies, I should say. Interesting thing, aphasia patients often have trouble with tools. So there's two types of aphasia based on two areas of the brain. There's Broca's area and there's Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is more associated with language production. It's all in the left hemisphere. And Wernicke's area is language comprehension. So Broca's aphasia would be you're unable to produce language, but you can still understand it. Wernicke's aphasia would be you're unable to understand language, but you can still speak. So basically, you could speak in what appears to be real language, but there's no real actual semantic meaning in there. Versus Broca's aphasia, you can't really speak. It all just sounds like gibberish. But you know what you understand everything, but you're unable to express it. And so people with, especially Broca's aphasia, will have trouble with using tools, and that shows that language and tool use often use the same pathways within the brain. Language production and tool use. Okay, time for a thought experiment. I want you to first of all, here's some more arrowheads in my collection right here. So right here is an ancient axe head right here. This is not ancient in the middle. It's made with electric tools. But this left one here is an ancient Native American axe head. Okay, found in around Iowa, that area. And on the right here, you'll find an arrowhead, 7,500 to 5,000 BC, thereabouts, somewhere in the same region. So 7,000 to 9,500 years ago. Okay, so thought experiment. I want you to think of some simple tool, some simple action. How would you teach that? Yep, some tool. How would you teach that to someone else? So imagine how to use a rock to crack open a nut, how to use a hammer to drive a nail into a piece of wood. How would you teach that? Okay, there's obviously going to be some order to how you teach it. You raise the hammer up first and you swing it down. It's rather simple, but there's an order, there's a syntax. Now imagine a new tool, slightly more complex. It could be anything. It could be making an arrowhead like this one or this one. There's a certain angle you have to hold your tool at. You have to press into the rock with a certain strength. You have to follow the steps in a certain order. You have to get a general shape first, and more fine-tuning shaping later on. You have to have a hierarchy of different goals, shorter term and longer term. So what do you want in the shorter term versus how should this object look in the longer term? And as you can imagine, as the tools become more complex, the order needs to be more complex. Your language needs to be more complex. So my idea is that these two ideas, tool use and language, are basically, you can almost say two sides of the same coin. Okay? So basically the idea is that in any instance where tool use is present, some form of language, however simple or complex, is also present. Here's some more arrowheads. Some of these are not original, like these ones around here. However, this middle row, second from the left, this yellow one, that is an old one, and right below it, gray, is also quite old. Okay, so I've created a chart right here. You can see learned behavior, breaking a nut with a stone. Very simple process. You don't need any tools. The language all ever required, minimal. You just need social imitation. You can see someone doing it. You don't need any sort of verbal language. You don't even really need gestures. Just copy someone else's movements. It's a form of gesture, but there's no real intent necessary. Now, Oldowan, or Mode 1, that was present around 2.6 million years ago. And that's some of the oldest stone tools that have been found. Tools to make tools. That's pretty simple. It's just you take one rock and you break off some chunks from another, and you basically create a somewhat sharpened edge that can be used to cut things. Pretty simple. And so the language level required, you could use increased imitation and proto-sign, proto-speech. Not full language as we have now would be necessary. And so as I said, gesture first hypothesis. Tools to make tools. So you need like another rock to hit against the rock that you're turning into a tool. A Schulian, Mode 2, 1.7 million years ago. Again, tools to make tools. Importance of striking accuracy. You need to be more precise. There's actual points that you need to break off to form. The order of the instruction is much more important. So there's more executive control required. It's often associated with over-imitation in proto-language, cognitive, communicative, affective traits for apprenticeship in the late Acheulean. And then Levallois, 300,000 years ago, Mode 3, Solutrean, Mode 4, 22,000 years ago. That's basically just going to be a little more complex than that, and much more complex shapes, you'll see. And then here's just a couple more examples of more complex tools. So making a sword of spirit, tools to make tools to make tools. So, what do you need to make say a sword? Well, you need a forge. You would need some sort of hammer to hammer out the steel, the iron. Okay, well, what do you need to make, say, that hammer? Okay, well, you need metal working equipment. You need tools. The tools. You can just imagine as everything becomes more complex, tools make tools. The form of recursion, you could say, more complex. And as you go down, there's a farther gap between the initial tool and the result. Okay, the observed pattern of activation and of overlap with language circuits suggests that tool making and language share a basis in more general human capacities for complex goal-directed action. Okay, part of this I've already kind of hit on a little bit. And here's some examples of, late Acheulean right here, early Acheulean, Oldowan. As you can see right here, that's much simpler. Just a basic point. Whereas here you have some bifacial thinning. Yeah, and right here's an example of multiple layers of goals within the hierarchy. You have some elementary percussion, multiple of those. Some bifacial thinning, shaping. A goal to do this, so you have a goal to do this, so you have a goal to do this. The grammars of action in human behavior and evolution. So this study involves tool replication experts. With a piece of flint, they either worked until it was exhausted, or they shaped into a refined hand axe, something that you would see within the Acheulean period, that mode 2 that we talked about. So all skilled behavior and associated neural activity is organized into a hierarchy, and then there's the syntax of act, or generalized schemata of action, which determine the sequence of specific act. Developed objective and generalizable methods to define and quantify action grammars with their neural correlates from behavioral data. And then there's detailed kinematics of hand actions to produce a tool, vary from trial to trial. There was invariant hierarchical structure underpinning performance. Some rules only occurred in Acheulean sequences. Stone toolmaking and the evolution of human culture and cognition. So flake detachment within flake detachment is formally recursive. You can imagine that you could have, it's flake detachment all the way down, as you could say. So, basically you have some flint blank right here, a stone, and you take a flake off with your issue stick. Then you can take a flake off of that area, and you're farther and farther down theoretically. I mean, practically you're going to stop at some point, but theoretically, you can just keep going away until that stone there's nothing left of it. And lower Paleolithic technologies advance in hierarchical complexity with time. It takes several hours to master Oldowan flaking, but it may take hundreds of hours for Acheulean flaking. In fact, they've even attempted to teach animals such as bonobos Oldowan techniques, and I will mention this a little later, a little bit, but basically the bonobo was able to comprehend some of the general ideas of how to do it, but they kind of lack some of that coordination, some of that ability to completely successfully create an Oldowan tool. An Oldowan lacks variation of flake production. More complex technology, more variance. All human technology could be on an exponential curve. You could see. So cumulative human culture, we're building on each other, on the prior advancements of others, and it all builds and builds in a exponential way. Exponential growth. So what is hierarchical structure? There's superordinate representations of multiple subordinate events. some arm movement that you make with your tool, with your deer antler, is subordinate to some superordinate goal. I'm doing this in order to have some result in the future. You have to have some mental representation of your goal in the end. It's not as simple as basically, it's one thing to take a rock and throw it at another rock, and then it breaks apart, and maybe that's what you wanted to have happen. There might have been some level of representation there, but it's much more complex with, let's say a Schulian, where you're taking small flakes away in order to shape it. So stimulus generalization, relational integration, temporal abstraction, goal abstraction, you have those goals that are farther, that are sometime in the future, farther temporally. And here's an example of exponential growth of our tools. Here's millions of years ago. But here's the Oldowan cleaver variants. It's just another type of tool. Blades, Levallois. And here's some more, almost like a syntax tree here. You can see Oldowan flake production. You have your raw materials that you need to get, and you're detaching some flakes. Change your grasp, rotate the object within your hand, and then it gets more complex here. You have your materials, primary flake detachment. There's target selection here, and second order preparatory flake detachment. And that was just the flake production for Schulian. Then there's the early Schulian shaping, multiple subgoals, late Schulian shaping, roughing out subgoals position. Okay, stone tools, language, and the brain in human evolution. And here's some of the same pathways that are followed by both language and tools. So Oldowan napping, it's associated with dorsal stream structures like the visuomotor grasp coordination, such as the anterior and inferior parietal lobe and ventral premotor cortex. It's consistent with behavioral evidence of sensorimotor and manipulative complexity, concrete simplicity, and lower hierarchical depth of Oldowan action. As I said before, bonobos understand the basic action plan, but they struggle with some perceptual motor coordination and afforance detection, so they can't really see the potential for making some tool in the future. So the latest Schulian also uses the same dorsal stream structures, but with more regions such as the pars triangularis. So basically the abstract representation of in hierarchical organization. Okay, so, building on what I said before, they can actually represent these actions internally to plan for the future. Their goals, what needs to be achieved for that goal. And then there's more inferior frontal gyrus in the latest Schulian. Not from increased manipulative complexity, but from higher order behavioral and cognitive control constructs of the right hemisphere. Okay, intentional communication. So there's the proto-sign system of intentional manual gestures, which provided a scaffold for later usage of proto-speech. You know, that's the gesture first hypothesis in a sense. There's a mirror system hypothesis, which is that the observer must infer goals with pantomime, but not with praxis, which is directly tied to observable instrumental goals. Toolmaking syntax has external physical constraints, but not internal rules. So this is an argument against the idea that toolmaking and language share the same cognitive bases. Basically saying, you know, with toolmaking syntax, you know, you have actual physical constraints on what you can and can't do. Versus with language syntax, it's all internal rules, you know, culturally accumulated. But the thing is about, even though they are physical constraints within the toolmaking syntax, you know, you can imagine a situation in which there's more affordance for some of these constraints. You know, you can depending on the situation, you could have less or more constraints, but the idea is theoretically some of these, you know, recursive chipping away at the stone, recursive flint knapping, thinning could go on forever. There's the technological pedagogy hypothesis, which is observation of complex praxis can induce high-level goal inference. Okay, so basically you're observing some of this tool making, and you know, you can, and because of this, you're seeing, you're able to you're able to see future goals. Learning. Later Schulian shows activation of the rostral interior medial prefrontal cortex, which is used for the attribution of intentions, complex action understanding, construction of shared pragmatic skills, and teleological understanding. Which is more evidence in support of the same underlying structures for language and tools. And there is a debate over whether toolmaking has sharing of abstract syntactical structures and semantic content. The question is, are these syntactical structures abstract, or is it all basically physical right there? Same with semantics. Okay, so the cognitive demands of lower Paleolithic toolmaking. So outcome prediction and strategic appropriateness about planned actions of partially completed tools. There's frequency of correct strategic judgments was predictive of success in Acheulean, but not Oldowan toolmaking. Okay. So more about correct judgments, you know, judgment and planning is more important within Acheulean. Novice toolmakers use executive function of function networks of perspective simulation to make correct strategic judgments. The ability to make these judgments predicted success with hand axes, but not with simple flake production. Okay, and that just goes to show, you know, that, as I said earlier, there is more executive function within the Acheulean mode 2, which is hand axes is something very important within that era. It's possible to measure the differential cognitive control demands of simple or Paleolithic technologies, and you can't solve causation between technology, cognitive, and neuroanatomical changes in human evolution, but you can allow direct comparison of cognitive control demands of archaeologically observable behaviors. That's what they did. They had people replicating some of these ancient strategies to make similar tools. The evolutionary neuroscience of toolmaking. So stone tool making is supported by a mosaic of primitive and derived parieto-frontal perceptual motor systems. Okay, so sensory motor, perceptual. Basically, the ability to have a communication between what you're doing, what you're perceiving. Naive toolmakers have no activation in the prefrontal executive cortices associated with strategic action planning, or an inferior parietal cortex, which is thought to play a role in representation of everyday tool use skills, which is different from some of the results with expert tool makers, which is interesting, which goes to show the way that your brain is being activated depending on your level of expertise. And uniquely human capacities for sensory motor adaptation and affordance perception rather than abstract conceptualization and planning were central factors in the initial stages of human technological evolution. Okay, it is that the conceptualization and planning became more important later on, which can be seen more in the Acheulean period after Oldowan, where it was more the sensory motor. Acquisition of the necessary sensory motor capabilities rather than executive capacities for strategic planning represents the critical bottleneck in the initial development of complex tool use and tool-making abilities. Social context necessary to support prolonged perceptual motor skill acquisition in early hominid toolmakers. Okay. And here you can see the evolution of the human brain, macaque, chimpanzees, humans. More pathways evolved between the how and what pathways here. And right here is an interesting piece, the learning niche. So you can imagine with individual practice, with your bodily imitation, object reenactment, in-state emulation, you know, you're practicing doing something, you're practicing making an arrowhead. And then there's social resources that give feedback and maybe they help you out doing something. You learn more about the goal, the end goal, the cause between what you just did and, you know, basically why something happened, why this flint chipped in this certain way. I didn't know before, but now I know. And then more social resources where you're being observed, you're given more instruction, and then you practice more. Right here, niche construction. It's going to affect more about how you react with your environment. Then right here in the anatomy, the dorsal stream, which is more on the movement processing, and then ventral stream, which is object processing. And they're going hand in hand right here. Okay. So there's a lot of importance in the role, in the evolutionary neuroscience of cumulative culture. There's a role of high fidelity production, whether it's manual, vocal, or artifact mediated, in grounding semantic meanings. Tokens anchor meaning and allow discrete recombination. So you can imagine some of these, artifact mediated, some of these tools being, tools, or the process to making a tool being a token that can be combined and given meaning based on its goal. And so the concrete tokenization is critical in the transition from broadly semantic to truly symbolic thought. And I'll start with tools. I started with the physical, and then some of those same underlying structures were exapted, or basically given a new evolutionary purpose to symbolic thought. If I wanted to think of a good analogy, you could think of the idea of a metaphor, when something is something else within literature. So, or simile, you compare this. You compare a great idea that you had to some lion. Well, in order to compare it to the lion, you had to have that physical object first, that physical lion, and then later you're able to mentalize it, imagine it in your head as that lion. And then the technological niche, the role of object manipulation and modification, indicated by evolutionary neuroscience. Goes into cumulative culture, in that we build on our technologies within society. Okay. Manual praxis in stone tool manufacture and the implications for language evolution. As I said before, praxis is basically, tool use. There's a strong association between Broca's area and the functions related to action recognition and manual praxis in human and non-human primates. As I said before, Broca's area is associated with language production. So there's a strong relationship between that language production area of the brain and praxis. Broca's area may be polymodal. Processing have originally adapted to action observation of orofacial and manual systems, and later exapted. As I said, exapted is given a new evolutionary purpose for language. So basically it was originally used for observing actions of different physical systems and assigning hierarchy to them, arranging them internally in a mental representation. And then that, you can imagine that basis for mental representation became the beginnings of language. And there's clear but limited evidence of partially overlapping networks, strongly suggesting that manual praxis and language share a foundation in human capacities for complex, goal-directed action, and are likely to have evolved in a mutually reinforcing way. So basically, which came first, tool use or language? Or both came from some underlying structure and they're kind of influencing each other and their evolution. Okay.
Which were inherited to live in the canopy. It's quite easy to live in the canopy if you're a small organism, but once you start getting larger, the great apes, our closest relatives, then you have to be much more. And it seems likely that they evolved their large brains, which we inherited, in order to be able to travel more safely around the forest canopy, moving between trees, moving on several branches. Things like orangutans are marvelous at actually being very careful and never out of these really heavy creatures. And so much of the theory is that we evolved our large brains, or the great apes did, which were inherited, in order to travel better through the trees. And then once they had those brains, they'd also used them to design the first wooden tools. And all the apes make amazing nests, which they use by cleverly bending all the branches of their tree out of the trees and breaking them in set ways. They know about the mechanics of trees and the mechanics of wood more than most people do. And that's given them a good night's sleep and allowed them to sort of evolve brains because they had such a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So
the lady called Jill Pruitt, who found that only about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Of course, before that, we had the idea that chimpanzees were killing animals using that sort of technique. So it was a wish to anthropologists to see that what we used to think of as particularly human is something that which is also the apes did as well. The one thing we do is that we make stone tools to make wooden tools. Apes, they just break a bit of branch off and then then strip it and have the tool. What we have to make a wooden tool is to make a stone tool first, and then use that stone tool to carve our wooden tools. It's a rather more complex process. We can make better tools, but that shows that we have to have a much more big imagination to see what I want to make a wooden tool. So first of all, I've got to make this other tool, and then I can use that tool and make the wooden tool. So it's sort of twice as complex, really, but it produces much better tools. That's the advantage we speak over the ape.
Okay. So what I just showed you was my interview with Roland Ennos that I did a while back, and he was talking about making tools to make better tools is the most important part of that. Yeah, the mechanics of wood is another thing. What he studies a lot. But basically, we make tool. As he said right here, I want to make a tool. So first of all, I've got to make this other tool, and then I can use that tool to make the wooden tool. So there is a greater investment placed in it, but you get better results. Okay, so what's the conclusion? So the results vary for both experts and novices in the experiments based on, the cognitive processes used for making Acheulean and Oldowan tools. Although it is quite clear that there's more, for example, executive processing, more hierarchical structure within Acheulean toolmaking. There is an underlying structure. And I think it's important to go back to, what is tool use? And it could be defined as the capacity to externalize one's representations and start using them as tools in the same way as humans use language as a tool. Humans use language in a general and systematic way for getting messages across and to reach desired goals. That is, they use language as a means to an end. They're both a means to an end. You could say that's a general definition that works for both of them. One interesting question is, which came first, language or tools? I asked this question before. Okay, could it be that language came first or tools? It appears that from the evidence that tools likely came first, based on the fact that something like Broca's area is used for both, but that's not confirmed. There's underlying structures that work for both. Both are organized in a hierarchical system. Was it our ability to use tools that, for example, increased our hand dexterity, that made it easier to do gestures that then became language? Or was it more, we had the ability to use language, and then we were able to share our experiences with others and show how to use various tools, and not just tools, but just teach other people how to do anything. And some more research is necessary to have a concrete answer on that. But it does seem to be rather clear that they do share similar underlying structures. And this has been shown across many fields: neuroscience, linguistics, anthropology, archaeology. And here's some additional resources to look more into it. Some references. Okay.